Dr. Darin Ingels, welcome to Women's Wellness Radio.
Oh, thanks for having me, Bridget.
Yeah, it's nice to connect with you again. We talked last fall. You were on our Mold Week Summit, and you gave us a lot of insight about that and good supplement tips. But another passion, probably a bigger passion for you, is Lyme disease. And
Right.
am I correct in knowing that you have a personal history with Lyme disease?
Yeah, well, that's really what kind of prompted writing the book is I got Lyme disease myself back in 2002. So, I went through pretty much what everyone else who with Lyme goes through in terms of, getting the diagnosis and treatment and trying a lot of things that didn't work. So it was really my personal experience with Lyme and having dealt with it for many, many years. And then now having treated thousands of patients with Lyme disease, really trying to put together what I found worked well for people, what didn't work, and really trying to lay out a roadmap for people on, this is what you can do step by step to really, overcome Lyme.
Yeah, it seems like such a complicated one, and I'm learning little by little, but I'm like, ooh, I'm not ready to take on Lyme. I might not ever be ready, so I'm glad that there's folks like you. So, we've had a couple, one or two other Lyme guests on the show, but it's been a while, so I feel like we should, cover some of the basics and some of
Sure.
the myths too, right? Like, I think one myth that was stuck in my head for a long time that you just got this if you lived in like Vermont or like a few states, but it's
Right.
really like, is it worldwide or just sections of the world?
No, it's really been reported worldwide, and we know that there are upwards of 300 different strains of the bacteria that potentially cause Lyme disease. We don't even know how many of them are significant, but there are a lot of different forms of this bacteria. But it's been reported in North America, South America, Asia, even Africa. I mean, I was at the ILADS conference last year, and they had several doctors from different countries in Africa that have reported Lyme there. So, the World Health Organization even came out and said, look, this is the fastest growing infectious disease in the world right now. So, we think it's really kind of a New England, central Midwest kind of problem, but really this is an infection we're seeing around the world.
Okay. And another myth is that it's only carried by ticks. And I don't think that's true anymore, is it?
Yeah, well, again, we've got some research out of Europe that suggests that both mosquitoes and fleas can transmit Lyme. It's
Mm.
interesting. I've spoken with some doctors here in the United States, and because the research wasn't done in the United States, they say, well, we don't really know if mosquitoes can transmit it. But I think there's some emerging evidence that that's not true. And it certainly makes a lot of sense because we do see a lot of people who get infected who don't necessarily live in areas that are known for Lyme disease. But we've also seen, that birds are becoming big vectors for taking these ticks and moving them outside of these
Uh,
regions. So,
okay.
bird leaves, Connecticut and goes to Virginia, and lands, and the ticks hop off, and then they start to proliferate, and now you start getting an infestation in those areas. So, we've been seeing ticks move away from their sort of home areas and really start to spread in different parts of at least the United States. But yeah, I think there's some pretty good evidence now that it's not just ticks anymore.
Okay. So, what was I just going to ask you? Yeah, and I think the climate has changed. Right? Climate's changing. We travel internationally. We travel more now. So, those are factors. Do you think that Lyme is getting more common because of some factors in modern life? Or do you think it's like always been here? We're just like understanding it more?
That's probably a little bit of both. I mean, there's definitely more cases of it.
Okay.
We're seeing it spread again throughout the world. Therefore, there's more cases. I think more and more healthcare providers are also becoming a little bit more savvy on diagnosing it. So it's probably a little bit of both, but hands down, I mean, there are definitely more cases now than there were 20 years ago. And again, as you mentioned, the World Health Organization in their report said, climate change is really a big driving factor, not just for Lyme, but really any kind of what we call vector-borne illness. So these are, mosquitoes and fleas. So, we've seen Zika virus, we've heard of dengue virus. Of course, we had the whole Ebola thing several years ago, which of course isn't transmitted by an insect, but we're starting to see a lot of these infectious diseases on the rise, and climate change is really a big driving part of that.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a loaded question or a controversial question. Do you think EMF is also contributing to this more Lyme showing up?
Well, I think part of the reason we're seeing more Lyme, the infection is certainly the catalyst, but what we find is that after a while, it can sort of transfer into an autoimmune problem. And with any kind of autoimmune disease, we have to really look at the terrain. What is it about the individual that allows that infection to go deeper and become more chronic or problematic? Again, if you
Oh,
had 20 people infected with the organism, they're not all going to get Lyme disease, or certainly chronic Lyme disease. So I think, we have to look at all these external factors that affect our immune system, affect our gut. And I think EMF is just one of those precipitating factors for some individuals. But,
yeah.
it's mold, and it's other underlying, gut problems, and, what chemicals have you been exposed to? I mean, all of that, has an impact on how your body and certainly immune system function. And I think that's part of why a lot of people end up with chronic Lyme disease. I mean, I can just
Mm-hmm.
speak for myself that, I had a lot of precipitating factors leading up to my infection. I mean, I used to work my dad worked for an oil company. I used to spend my summer climbing in big oil tanks in Long Beach without a respirator and getting all this petrochemical exposure. And then I worked in a hospital lab where we would stick our hands in xylene and toluene and very toxic substances, not thinking that maybe
Oh,
this is
wow.
bad for you. So, it's easy to kind of go backwards and say, yeah, sometimes we see that there's these obvious things and sometimes they're not so obvious. But it's important, I think, with any kind of chronic illness is that you're doing that head to toe. What have you been exposed to that may be, undermining your body and certainly the immune system?
That's a really good point. Yeah, I was at a toxins conference a month or two ago, and they're like, whatever toxin that tipped the scale for you was just like the most recent toxin.
Right.
Like it was everything else. And it is good to remember, and that we all respond a little differently to things like EMF, and like you and I have talked about mold. And so yeah, we all have our history. I want to show your book for a second. You got it in the background there too, called the Lyme Solution, a 5-part plan. It's beautiful. Congratulations. Got a little fake tick on it, which probably
I
freaks
know it freaks a lot of people out.
so there's a quiz in here about, could you have Lyme? And I didn't actually write it down, but I did look it over. I mean, I'm one of those people that you probably meet people like me who are like, I have pretty serious mold toxicity, and some people say, well, you always have Lyme when you have mold, they always go together. And there's part of
Yeah.
me that's like, no, I don't want to know about that. Although when I take the quizzes, I don't see myself in some of the symptoms. I do see myself in others of the symptoms. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about symptom diagnosis versus the testing.
Sure. Well, people need to understand that Lyme is a clinical diagnosis. And what that means is it really is based on your symptoms. The lab testing that we do is really just designed to help confirm your suspicion. But even if you go to the CDC's website and you read about Lyme diagnosis, it says right there, and I don't know if it's black and white, maybe it's blue and white, but it says that, it really is based on, having the symptoms and typically living in an area that's endemic. We've had problems with Lyme testing for 40 plus years. And the test that the CDC recommends, what they call a 2-tier testing, was really designed for people, A, that have acute Lyme disease, and B, probably got the bullseye rash, which isn't even half the people who get Lyme. When you start getting, months or years away from your infection, immunity naturally wanes. And so since these are antibody tests, it's really measuring the quantity of antibody. So if it's been 10, 20 years since your exposure, your immune response probably isn't now what it was at the time of your initial exposure. And so since we're measuring quantity, if there's less quantity, it's going to look negative on paper. So, there are better labs out there, and we've learned that, the standard reference labs are still kind of towing the line and following, you start with a Lyme screen, and if that test is positive, it flexes over to what's called a Lyme Western blot. And that's sort of the confirmatory test for Lyme. Again, we know that the sensitivity of that Lyme screen test is only about 43%. So a good lab test will be at least 95% sensitive. So that means if you actually have the disease, what's the likelihood that that test is going to pick it up? And what the research suggests is that it doesn't even pick up half the people that have Lyme. That's a
Mm,
pretty terrible test.
yeah.
So, it's always got to be taken into consideration, the symptoms that you have. You have to rule out other possibilities too. I mean, do you have lupus? Do you have rheumatoid arthritis? Do you have mold toxicity? It's very easy, when you're in the Lyme world to think everything's related to Lyme, and sometimes it's not. But, you kind of go through the process of ruling out these other possibilities. And when all those tests keep coming back negative, but you've got that collection of symptoms that suggest Lyme, you can kind of put two and two together. But, I think a lot of us who work in the Lyme world are working with labs that specialize in Lyme testing, which means that their test kit's a little bit different, the sensitivity's better, and it's also the way that they're reporting the results is a little bit different. So it at least gives us a better indication about whether you may have been exposed to Lyme or some of these co-infections.
And at the doctor's office. Sure, sure. And I think like for me in the moment, just to kind of process how I'm thinking about it as other people may be thinking about it at home, is like, I sort of I have plenty to deal with right now. And if I can get my mold levels down, hopefully I feel better. And if I don't, I guess I could start looking for other things. And I'm sure whatever I'm doing now, working on my gut, detoxifying, I would think it would have some positive effect on the terrain, like you said, if I were to have Lyme.
Sure. Well, I said it's really about total load. And, the one thing I think that we all as healthcare providers struggle with is to try and piece together how much does each part play a role in the way that you feel. For you, mold may be 90% of the problem. For somebody else, maybe Lyme is 90% of the problem and mold's only 10%. So, it's kind of hard to quantify. And it's really not until we go forward with treatment and see how much people respond that we kind of get an idea about, okay, yeah, if I did Lyme treatment and you're 80% better, I know that Lyme was 80% of your problems, and that extra 20%, well, now we need to look at some of these other factors. So,
okay.
That quiz that I put in the book is really just a kind of a quick, easy way that people can get an idea about whether that's something they really should be looking a little bit deeper into. I think when you live in areas outside of, New England and the central Midwest, where at least a lot of doctors kind of ignore Lyme, and people just feel like, something's wrong. I've been to the doctor, I've had all these tests done, everything's negative, it just doesn't make sense. And they take that quiz and they score very high. It's like, wow, yeah, no one's really investigated Lyme. So maybe I need to work with someone who can go down that rabbit hole with me and try and figure out if that's part of the problem. But, because a lot of these symptoms are somewhat characteristic of Lyme, Lyme also has a lot of symptoms that are vague and they look like, 1,000 other things. But a lot of these things are very typical to Lyme. And again, when you start checking these off, it can at least give you an indication that you may have had that exposure.
Okay. So you have a 5-part plan here, a 5-stage immune boosting plan, you call it. So
Yeah.
I want to start with kind of like some of the juiciest parts in here, and then we can see what all we have time for. So you really focus on herbal treatment over antibiotics, I believe, for Lyme. And just tell us more about that.
Well, again, this was kind of based out of my own experience. I mean, I was on antibiotics for about 9 months. So when I first got, I had classic Lyme disease. So when I first got infected, I was on doxycycline. And after 4 days of treatment, I felt great. I was fine. But I really got bit 3 weeks before I opened my practice. So when I opened the business, I was doing everything. You're the doctor, the bookkeeper. So I'm stressed. I'm not eating well. I'm not sleeping well. And after about 8 months, I started relapsing and got symptoms again. So I went back on antibiotics and it did nothing. And I kept changing antibiotics for about 9 months and I got worse and worse and worse. So my own experience is after that, I found a doctor in New York City who was treating me with Chinese herbs. And within a month, I felt about 85% better. So that was my reminder, as a naturopathic doctor, that I kind of need to go back to my roots of, using plants and, taking care of myself and doing all these things I kind of been telling my patients to do. And that's really what kind of turned a corner for me. But, I think there's always a concern for people that, herbs aren't as powerful as antibiotics. And I'd say these are people who really don't understand herbs. A lot of drugs are made from herbs. They have very potent. And again, they're our way of concentrating herbs. Dr. Zhang, who's the doctor I worked with, his Chinese herbal formulas are very concentrated. They're very powerful. And there's another set of herbs from Dr. Cowden that have actually been researched by a woman at the University of New Haven named Dr. Eva Sappi. And she's actually compared it against doxycycline. And her research found it actually works better than doxycycline. So there's even evidence that the herbs may be even better than the antibiotics. And in fact, there was a report that just came out last week, found that people that had been on appropriate antibiotic therapy, that I forget the percentage of people, but there was a fair number of them that still had Lyme, even though they'd undergone the appropriate treatment. So, you can't have what are called persister cells, which are these just resistant forms of bacteria that just don't respond to antibiotics. So then what?
Mm,
And I think there's
yeah.
some doctors who will keep trying to add antibiotics, use 3, 4 in combination. Uh, and look, my feeling is if you're doing something that's working for you, great. But the large percentage of people I'm working with have already been down that road. They didn't get better or maybe got worse, and they're looking for alternatives. So I think this is a viable alternative. Again, it worked for me. It's worked for a lot of my patients. And I think the damage that's done to the body is certainly far less than what happens with antibiotics. And even some of the research shows that, antibiotics for chronic Lyme, in most cases, really aren't very effective. A lot of people feel better temporarily, and then as soon as they come off the antibiotics, they're kind of back to square one. So I'm more interested in longer term solutions that's going to cause less damage to the body. And again, I think herbs are a viable option for people.
Yeah, I love to see, you do every now and then see like a head to head on a herb versus a medication, and it's often really impressive. So I think there needs to be more studies like that. And like you said, the antibiotics are so hard on what's already a weakened host. My understanding too is that Lyme is good at hiding. So can the antibiotics always get to it if it's burrowed into
Yeah, well,
organs and tissues?
yeah, I mean, that's a great point is that, Lyme is truly a shapeshifter, and it can actually, Lyme itself is this sort of corkscrew shaped organism called a spirochete. And what it can do is it can literally ball itself up into a little round ball. It's what they call a round body or cyst form. And when it goes into that form, it really seems to evade the immune system. So part of Dr. Sappy's work is she looked at Lyme in these different forms, and again, using the herbs and doxycycline. Well, doxycycline only worked when Lyme was in its uncoiled form. It actually didn't do anything when it was in its round body form. But when she used the herbs worked in all of the forms. So it found it was killing Lyme even when it balled itself up. So where, the antibiotics may drive that organism into a different shape, so it kind of naturally evades the immune system, herbs don't seem to have that same effect. So, this ultimate shapeshifter may be, thwarted by, using herbs.
Okay, awesome. So tell us a little bit more about, where people can get the book, what they'll find in the book. I wonder if you have any, additional goodies for people who buy the book or free chapter, any of that good stuff.
Yeah, well, people go to my website, DarinIngels.com. It's DarinIngelsND.com. There's information about the book. We also, if you sign up for our list, I have a free, you can get a free chapter of the book if you're interested, but we also have we have a free top 10 immune boosting recipes, free ebook that we'd love to share with people, so they can download that as well. And we also have our quiz online if people are interested in downloading that, if they don't have the book yet, just as a kind of way of checking out and seeing if, Lyme might be something that they're dealing with. So all of those are available through our website. And again, we've got a lot of information about Lyme disease, but you can also find the book at any major book retailer.
Okay, awesome. So we'll link to that at the show notes and the blog notes. It seems like the book's doing really great. What are you finding about the response to it so far?
So far, so good. It's kind of interesting this year. Spring's very late, so Lyme is just now really kind of starting to, make the headlines again. Of course, May is Lyme Awareness Month, so there's a lot of chatter out there, and we're seeing more stuff coming out. So again, we're seeing a little uptick in book sales. But again, my goal of this book is that people have a great reference source. And again, if they're working with a practitioner who's kind of new to Lyme, this is something they can share with them to help navigate Lyme.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was thinking about it earlier as you talked about some of your experience with clients, that I would imagine that these are people who aren't feeling well and aren't getting better. They're usually doing their own seeking of information, like, because they're like, what could it be? So similar to mold. Like, I don't think mold will ever be like a best-selling New York Times best-selling book if I were to write one. But if you're sick and your wheels are turning, like, what could it be? You're going to wonder, is it Lyme? Is it mold? And, I love that people stay motivated like that. So I think that people will, keep finding the book and practitioners like me who need more Lyme education can also benefit from it, because I think you probably get pretty specific on some of the herbs you like, and you talk
Yeah.
about diet and exercise, right?
Yeah, well, so the book was really written for, the person out there who's dealing with these issues. And it really is just a step-by-step, roadmap on what you need to do to overcome Lyme. So I talk specifically about a certain diet you should follow. We talk about all the different supplements you can take to help with, your energy, your sleep, your mood, and so forth. And of course, all the different Lyme protocols. So again, it's really written for you, the Lyme person out there who might be struggling on your own.
Kind of getting started. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's great. I mean, when we talked earlier about the antibiotics, I also find in our field that uh, even though many people in our culture now are interested in the natural approach, we also want the quick fix to some extent. And I think that the doctor who's like, I'm a Lyme specialist, I'm a mold specialist, and I'm an MD who can prescribe, like, they get put on a pretty high pedestal. And many of the mold people on my group are like, oh, well, I've got to find a doctor near me who can give me all the drugs. And I'm kind of like, I don't like to see that as being billed as like the only thing that works, because I think, like you said, it sometimes isn't the thing that works. It's too strong,
yeah.
or it's just not effective. So really, before we get ahead of ourselves, I can understand that people are desperate for a solution when you're feeling so crappy. But at the same time, like, sometimes you have to take a step back and, like, how is my diet? Am I sleeping? And you cover all that in the book.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly for people with Lyme, and I think because there's so much overlap with mold, and I know you've probably seen it with your patients as well, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's a long-term process. And, I think all the things that kind of led up to people feeling the way that they feel, rarely do I see that changes in a few weeks. I mean, we might see improvement, but to get to the point where you really kind of feel like you're back to yourself again and you're symptom free, I mean, it's, months, it can be a year, and sometimes longer. So I think everyone kind of needs to understand that this is not a quick fix, and that, we're trying to find things that work with your body, not against it.
Yeah.
And, even coming kind of back to the antibiotics, we know that antibiotics can damage your mitochondria. Well, this is the part of your cell that literally creates energy. So if you've got chronic fatigue and you're taking a medication that's constantly damaging the part of your cell that makes energy, you can imagine you're probably never really going to get your energy while you're on that protocol. So, how do we start finding things that, again, kind of work with your body instead of against it? And I think that's, kind of where we're coming from.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show, Dr. Ingels, and good luck with the book. Thanks for following this mission. We really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thanks for having me again, Bridget. Appreciate it.